Right. So, what we discussed about in the previous session, I have discussed about different commands which will be used in SQL to write queries, all that, right? Insert, delete, update, all that, right? So DDL, DML, at the same time DQL means data query languages. All these were discussed in the previous session. Today, I'm going to discuss about the SQL part. This is an editor of SQL. This SQL is something which must be connecting with some database because there must be some database connectivity is required. In context to that, generally we use MySQL database, which isn't connected yet. That will connect it later. But let me explain you how and for what purposes generally the SQL is being used and what are the options which are available and how to use of it. Because there are few things which we have to know, especially when it comes to the SQL Server is concerned, because I already mentioned earlier also, repeating the same. SQL nothing but structured query language. Means if you want to write any queries, right? So if you want to write any queries and all everything, so these queries will be written over here, right? So because let's say if you want to extract the data or insert the data, update, delete, edit, right? So whatever the data and we are using for our project related purposes, if we want to update any information as such, generally this SQL is what something generally we use. But if you want to run the SQL, there is a database connectivity which is required. So this is where generally MySQL is coming to picture. Let me open it from the beginning so that you'll be understood well. Okay, let me open it. I'll close it and then I'll open. Okay, so that you can see over here, because there was an installation process of SQL which can be downloaded. Tomorrow I'll show you, right? So how to install it, right? So how to connect and all everything. I'll show you the installation procedure tomorrow. So you can see this is an option called MySQL over here. Here you can see MySQL Workbench 8.0 CE, right? So MySQL Workbench is what something required for us to write any queries on SQL. At the same time, if we want to connect the database and if you want to update any information from any local server, means if you want to connect any local server, that's where generally we have to use that. Now what I have done is that I have just selected MySQL Workbench. So this is how generally MySQL Workbench is being looks like. Okay, I am explaining from the beginning of it, right? So please follow it. Okay, this is how generally the first editor which you can see. Okay. Now here you can see there is an option called file. Okay, because for example, if we want to create any kind of new models, okay, any new models if you want to create, or if you want to create any new query tab means I already explained earlier, right? For example, if you want to edit some information or if you want to delete, update, right? So if you want to perform any of that activities and all that, so this query tab is being used for. At the same time, there is an option called edit, right? So that is not something more of use of it. But here, this is important. This is database, where if you want to connect to any kind of databases and all, here you can see there is an option called connect to database. So that whatever the required new connections of SQL, which is to be performed and required, all this can be done over here. This is where generally this connecting to database is what something is useful to that. Followed by this, if there is any kind of tool configuration, if you want to do for backup restoring purposes, normally this will be done by the data admin team, because database administrators who are experienced in the database management side, either it can be of any database, right? So because some people may follow Oracle, some people may follow MySQL, right? So what are the databases and all? So database configurations, backup, restoration connections, right? So all these things is what something will be done under the tools part. Next is scripting, whatever the scripting, like new scripting if you want to write, or if you want to install any plugin modules, right? So all these things is what something we can use it. Now here you can see there is an option called file, right? So where you can see a model. Before that, let me, yeah, you can see, right? So there is new model over here. This is where generally model is what something which usually looks like, right? So do remember this is the one which I have mentioned about creating new model, not query. Okay, writing queries are different. Writing queries means for in particular data, whatever is required and all, you need to have a queries for that, right? We need to write down the queries. Different queries. These are all we call it as statements, right? Because in the previous session, I explained that. I hope you guys have understood. Okay, now this is generally for model. Okay, this is what generally I have selected. You can see there is an option called new model, which was selected. Now in this new model, usually if there is any kind of model which we wants to open from the local site, because normally what happens when we are working on standalone systems, whatever the data which is required for us will be there in our existing data normally. But in some cases, what will happen, there is multiple systems, workstations and all everything we connected where we might require to access the server data and all everything from other locations. We might need it. So on that regard, generally this is an option which is usually happens, right? So this is where generally this will be open, right? So if you want to access any models, right? So for example, if you want to identify the employee data set, right? For example, right? So employee ID set, or else if you want to go for SQL, right? So if you want to see for data visualization purpose or something of that sort, right? For data visualization purpose or something like this is where generally these database models and all everything is what something will be useful for that, right? So this is where it was. Let's say, for example, I'm just giving an example to you, okay? I'm not going into detail, right? So let's say, for example, for example, for the salary purposes, you can see over here. So make sure we need to open the data and we need to open it, right? So, but make sure we need to have a connectivity. This is something required. Workbench connectivity is something essentially needed to have it, because this is where generally database is something used. So when we are going to create any kind of models, especially in reference to the importance of SQL to write, it's always important to have our own database. Database connectivity is what something is required. But not only one database, we may be required to create multiple databases also, because sometimes there will be a load, because in the previous sessions also I told you load balancing. I have told you a point. What is load balancing? Load balancing means, for example, more traffic is there in one server, automatically the data remaining load has to be transferred to the next server. That's how it must be, right? So then only that server load will be balanced among the servers. So that the balance will be there. So that the balance will be there. So the application or the site, whatever we are using and all, everything may not be, may not, what we can say, may not go down, right? So it won't fail, right? So that's the reason why it's always important, depends on the kind of projects, what is that we are working on, depends on the requirement we have, whatever the databases we are creating and how many databases are we going to create and all everything will be as separate, right? That is something different from one to another. It will not be the same in all the cases. This is where generally this file, new model and all everything are something useful, right? So this is where generally we use it. At the same time, these are the ones which was open recent. Of course, these were my previous works. You can see over here, whatever the recent openings which I have taken, because these are all we call it as data sets. Whatever the CSV files you can see, right? Excel files you can see here, right? These are all we call it as data sets. So these data sets is what something which we have to open and work upon, right? That's what generally this open recent is what something will be used over here. So this is one thing which we have to know in context to the SQL part. This is point number one. And at the same time, whatever the required data which is to be updated and all, as I told you, this is where generally this we have to be connected. This is one way of doing it. Or else we can write down a new query model directly. Depends on the requirement what we have and all everything. This is where generally we have to use it. This is first point. Second point, editing option is not something needed. That leave it. Okay. This view also not a model. This is where generally diagrams are there because there are different diagrams which we may be required to prepare, right? So for example, if you want to add any kind of diagram, right, any kind of stories, right? So let's say that if you want to create any kind of entity relationship diagrams. So what is entity relationship diagrams? These are the diagrams which are useful to create entity among the database, because databases have different tables, right? So different tables will be there in the database. So whatever the tables are we going to create, those tables, every table will have some interconnectivity. So whenever we are going to create any kind of databases, it's always important for us to create whatever the connectivities do we have, whatever the kind of ER diagrams we want to prepare, whatever the kind of model which we have to be created, right? Or else if you want to create any kind of diagrams as such, this is where generally we have to prepare. But there are two options. Adding diagrams or creating a diagrams need not be required SQL to be performed all the time, because we have another option. Yeah. So we have another option, as I mentioned earlier, we have another option for we have another option of preparing these diagrams and all everything using star UML, etc. Because in the previous sessions, if you remember, I have shown you how to prepare use case diagram, sequence diagram, all that. In the same way, not only use case and sequence diagram, uh, we have already not only use case and sequence diagram, we have an option where we can prepare entity relationship diagrams or requirements diagrams, right? All these can be prepared using that tool. That is one way of doing it. So, because depends on the organization to organization, what kind of tools are we going to use may vary. It will not be the same in all the cases. It will not be the same in all the occasions. So these diagrams may vary from time to time. That is one thing which we have to be known with, which we have to be known with. This is where generally add diagrams and all everything are coming into picture. Next, after that, the next one about the database part, as I told you, if we want to connect any kind of databases and all everything. So any kind of migration wizard. Migration wizard means sometimes data migration is what something we do. Data migration means, let's say there was an existing old database which was already there, where there is a lot of data which is involved in it. Now what we have to do, we have to migrate the data from old legacy systems to the new application, data migration. Let's say there was some patient information which was there in the old system. Now what we have to do now, that old system server is different, whatever the file format that consists of, because generally files will be loaded in different formats, like either it can be in XML format, right? Or it can be in JSON format nowadays, right? So different file formats will be used. So we must be knowing about what are all these file formats, in which file format that was earlier, earlier. And now to which file format we have to migrate. Because let's say they want to migrate this to the XML document. That's how generally data has to be integrated and transferred in a data migration for XML purposes. So we must be knowing about XML part for sure, right? So you need to have, not we, no, I'm not saying we, because usually as people, whoever is doing, I'm saying, okay. So having understanding over XML integration or XML transformation is what something one has to know, right? So then only it is more useful to them to understand much better and clear. This is where generally migration. So for that, what is required? They have to create a staging environment. They have to create a staging database. So once they have created a staging environment in database, this migration can be taken place. So this is how generally the structure as well as the schedules and all everything is what something will go. So this is how generally these databases and all everything are something useful when we are working on it, right? This is something which essentially required, right? So this is something required, which is what something we have to be performed over here, right? This is what it was. Next, if there are any kind of tools, right? So because, for example, if you want to connect any kind of tools or the objects, right? So or if there is any kind of utilities do we have, right? So all these backup connections, restore connections, all these tools is what something we have to be identified over. This is where generally tools are being used, right? So different tools can be used, and whatever the required tools and all everything is what something will be used of it. Next was scripting, right? So if there is different scriptings will be there, like Unix or Linux like that, like there will be some shell scripting and all of that. That's not needed. Okay, at the same time, if you want to install any kind of plugin modules, plugins and all that, new plugins, if you want to install any new plugins and all everything, we have an option where we can add the plugins to the existing ones. Means if you require some additional information where you may be required to add some new plugins to the existing application, where we have a choice to plug into the application is what something we have to see. This is where generally scripting and all everything is what something comes into picture. Next was help. This is all something relating to the help part, right? That is something different. This is what and how usually this MySQL workbench is what something will be shown when we are working on the, especially when we are trying to create any kind of models, or if you want to open any kind of new models or something of that sort. This is what something we have to know with. Next, here you can see there is an option called document priorities, right? So document properties. These document properties, this is where generally when there are any kind of new models we are creating, based upon the kind of version, whatever the document properties do we have. So based on the versions and all that, this is where generally this project as well as this document properties is what something we have to create. So the document properties can be prepared along with that, and subsequent documents can be updated equal to that. That's how generally this is what something which normally we do whenever we are working on the diagrams, all that stuff. Now coming back to the point, because this is where generally I discuss with you, model we have discussed, add diagram. This is where generally add diagrams and all everything come into picture. So apart from that, always you have one more option here. You can see there is an object called schema, because this is add diagram which I have already discussed with you. Here you can see there is an option called schema, because if you want to create any kind of schemas, right? So for example, MyDB is what generally the schema we have created. If you want to create a schema, or if you want to create any kind of table, let's say for example, if you want to create any kind of tables, right? So for example, uh, customer, right? So this is where, right? So this is where generally customer name, let's say, for example, I'm just giving an example to you, right? So customer name is what something we are creating in reference to the table, etc. All that, right? So at the same time, if you want to create any kind of default chart cells, or if you want to create any kind of default correlations and all everything is what something we can create. So like this, what we can do, if you want to create any kind of new schemas, whatever is required, because MyDB is what one schema which was already there. These are the physical schemas. Okay. The second schema is about the second schema is all about customer name, right? So this is where generally this customer name, this is one schema, MySQL schema was there. So where if we want to create any kind of new models or new schemas here, so always we have a choice where you can see there is an option called plus, where if you want to create how many schemas we want to create, all these schemas can be created like this. Subsequently, you can see over here, whatever the tables were mentioned over here, and whatever the tables which are required for us to create, whatever the kind of means, if you want to add any kind of tables, or if you want to Okay, add any kind of views, or if you want to create any kind of routines or add groups, or else if you want to create any kind of schema privileges, or if you want to create any kind of SQL scripting, right? So if you want to create any or add any kind of scriptings, all these things is what something we can do, right? So when we are creating a new schemas, this is how a new schema can be created. Okay, let's say customer name. For example, right. So address is what one more schema which was created, right? So one more address was created, right? So, but the advantage is that whatever the schema, physical schema created, for example, customer name, right? So this is what in this customer name, if you want to add any kind of tables, right? If you want to create any kind of tables, yeah. So if you want to create any kind of tables, right? Here you can see there is an option called table. I'll show you tomorrow. I will show you how to create tables on it. Right? So we can create the tables, right? So we need to create the table name. At the same time, we need to identify, say this is there, you can see there is a schema called customer name is what we have selected. And whatever the tables are we going to create over here, you can see everything will be under the customer name only, right? Because we don't see anything as separate, because it will be on the customer name. So the advantage is that whatever the physical schemas, if we want to create whenever we are working on SQL, it's always we have a choice and advantage where we can create customer names and all everything as separate. Subsequently, if you want to create any kind of tables and all everything can also be created. So this is also one of the core advantage we have. Whatever the required tables and all everything is what something we can create. So this is where generally this tables, etc., is what something will be used when we are working on MySQL. When we are working on MySQL Workbench, MySQL models and all. This is how generally this customer name, address, and all everything is what something which we have to create. So this is how generally adding new schemas and all everything are something useful when we are working on the project. Okay, next one about, for example, if you want to add new tables, here I have told you, right? So add tables is what something you can see over here. Means if you want to add any kind of add new tables and all, here you can see add table. You can give a table name though, right? So this is how, and you can give a table name, right? So custom table type, right? All these things and all, and finally you can create subsequently. This is one option. Otherwise, we have an option here called add table where we can directly create. So we have two options. Either we have all the options for every schema, whatever the physical schemas we have created. We have an option, all the schemas can be added to the existing repository. That is one advantage we have. So apart from that, otherwise, if you want to create any new tables and all, here you can go directly over here and you can select add new table and whatever the tables we require. Because unless until if there is no table, we have created data table. So how can you store the data? Because in the beginning of SQL sessions, if you remember, I told you, if you want to extract any information from any database and all, first of all, there are some tables required. So because without tables, whatever the information you are storing, where that data will be stored, the data has to be stored in the subsequent. The data has to be stored in the subsequent data tables only. For example, customer name we have taken, that has to go and store in the particular column, right? The particular column there only, right? In that location only, it has to store. Customer name has to be stored in the customer name column. Address or phone number or customer ID, whatever that columns we have, subsequently and that columns we have to update all that. That's what and how generally we do it, right? So this is where generally, so what will happen now? So now if you want to add tables and all, because there are three layers, because I told you in the beginning also, there is a presentation layer. Through this presentation layer, input will be given. Where the input has to store, this input will be stored in the database. So where the database, either it can be say Oracle or SQL Server database will be there, where all the data will be stored. But we cannot simply store the data, right? The storing of data must be in a proper manner. That is, for that reason, it's always important to have data tables. Data tables are required. So that extraction will be not only easier, it will be required also, because you get the accurate information. If you have not created tables, you don't get the accurate information, because you want to know the customer. Let's say you are developing a banking application. Now you want to know about the customer who is maintaining average $500 in every quarter. Right? You want to know it in a particular location, right? For people whoever belongs to a particular location, for example. So you want to know that. So this is out of your business maybe requirement, or if you want to have some interest, business interest, you want this. So what we have to do, exact that information you have to store. You have to get the data based on the people, underline this point, based on the people who are maintaining $500 in every quarter, average. That data is required. You don't require everyone who are maintaining 500. Average 500 is what you're, not as of now. Because let's say a customer is not maintaining any transaction so far, and finally in the last quarter end he has given $500 in his account, then there will be, because there won't be any average. Because average means end of the day, the simple calculation by end of the day, how much amount was there in the account is what something which normally we taken into consideration when we are taking average on that. So this is where generally you want to know. So there are different tables which we have to create. So once the table is created, whatever the data we want to store into that will be subsequently done by that later. This is where generally these data tables. Yeah, sorry. This is where generally these data tables and all everything is what something which normally we create. This is what it was. So this is where generally these data tables and all everything are what something which we have created whenever we are working on the project. Right? So this is where generally these tables and all everything come into picture. After tables, the next one is about add new view. For example, if you want to add any kind of new view, you can see here, right? So if you want to create any new view, whatever the table we have created. So prior to that, if you want to create any kind of view for a particular activity, whatever we are creating, all this view can be created over here, right? So this is where generally this creation of view and all everything, right? So all this information will be updated. This is where you can see there is an option of DDL. You can see over here, right? So DDL, because DDL stands for data definition language. In the previous session, if you can go back, you will be knowing, right? So DDL, data definition language, DML, data manipulation language, DQL, data query languages, like that, right? That will be there. So this is where generally this DDL, right? So if you want to create any kind of new views, right? So all these things and all everything, this is where generally these DDLs and all everything are something useful if you want to create any kind of new view, all that stuff. Next, if you want to create any add new routine, right? So if you want to create any kind of routines, new routines, all that stuff, this is where generally these routines and all everything are something useful, right? So if you want to create any kind of create routine procedures, right? So these routine procedure steps and all everything is what something which will be added to the existing ones. This is how and what usually these tables, these routines, views, right? So all these things is what something which normally we create whenever we are working on the database, right? So this is what generally which we have to be done with. So this is where generally this all this MySQL workbench is what something we need to know. So one is about the view part, whatever the kind of physical schemas we have created, how many schemas are we going to create depends on the size of the project. It will vary. It will not be the same for all the projects. This may vary, depends on the kind of size of the project what we have. So depends on the size of the project, whatever the new tables are we going to create, right? Whatever the new views we are going to create, right? So all these things is what something which normally we have to do, we have to perform whenever we are working on the projects, whenever we are working on the files, right? So all these things is what something which we have to be known. Next is a connection of database. You can see there is an option called connect to database. Here you need to identify what was the stored coaching, right? For example, if you want to create a new connection, right? New connection method, what kind of connection method it was and all. Next, you need to identify and check the parameters because SSLs and as well as SSL certification, SSL is required over here. At the same time, you need to know about the kind of other advanced version, like which version it was there, right? Last connected, etc. Next, if you want to identify any kind of root name or something like, you have to give the root names. And followed by this, if there is any kind of password or something like any default schemas do we have. So that sort of things is what something we have to do, but make sure there must be some connectivity of data is what something we have to be prepared. So without connection of data and all everything, this is not something which we do, right? So because connection of data is something essentially required. Connection of data is what something essentially needed when we are creating the database and all, right? So we have an option. MySQL model is what something. If you want to create a SQL and all everything, this is where generally SQL files are needed, right? Different SQL files are needed, and whatever the schemas we require, right? Whatever the schemas we have to be updated, all this has to be done, right? So then only this database connectivities is all something which is useful for us where we can connect it. Importance of is that we have to update the data because you have to call the data, right? Because when we unless until if you don't have a database, from where you call the data, because there must be a repository to store all the information. To store the information, what is that you require? You required some database to be prepared, to be needed, right? So these database, right? So these database can be multiple because as I told you, due to the load balancing issues and all, organization wants to create multiple databases, right? So there are options. Sometimes they may require you to create multiple databases. If they require any kind of multiple databases, what is that they want you to create? So all these can be created in this, right? So this is where generally this database connection of databases, right? So whatever the databases we have to create. At the same time, whatever the physical schemas do we have, either it can be relating to MyDB or the kind of new schema relating to customer name, address, whatever we have created subsequently. This is where generally all this information has to be updated in the application. Along with this, here you can see there is an option called history. You can see over here. Means if you want to add any kind of new diagram or schema, here you can see. Okay, all the creation of tables, right? So view of the tables, right? So all these things, this history can be seen. Followed by this, there are some user types, right? So for example, if you want to edit the user type, right? So if you want to edit the user type or not, here you can edit the user type and you can add. So subsequently, adding a user types and all everything is what something, because users can be anyone. People who are working on the data is what something on this application is what generally we call it as users. So sometimes these users can be mostly internal users because a report generation is what something we have to do. Internal users are someone who are essentially required when we are working on it. So user types and all everything are essentially needed when we are working on the application. So that is one thing which we have to be known with, followed by whatever the type of users do we have, right? So because depends on the kind of roles and responsibilities what they maintain and how how the responsibilities and all everything they will be maintaining and all everything is what something which normally we see. This is where user types and all everything are something useful here. Along with this routine, it's something like where if you want to write any kind of comments, right? So if you want to create any kind of comments or if you want to write any kind of comments, all these kind of comments can be written, right? This is one of the area which we can do. At the same time, if you want to assign any kind of roles, sometime back I told you, right? So these are the available roles. Whatever the roles are available and whatever the roles are required. So, and these roles, based upon the roles, whatever are available here, right? So you can see roles like owner or a table read only, because we normally only modification of tables or inserting the data Inserting the data, of course, but table modification will be given only for admin people, because normally editing the data, normally we don't give it for everyone. Editing the data will be given only for limited people. We don't give it for every person, because normally it won't be allowed to do that, right? So because only admin guys will only do the table modifier, right? So all that will be done by them. But table insert, yes, because table insert or inserting the table data, right? So if you want to read only, that can be given for the users, whoever the users do we have. So we can give it to those users. That's not an issue. But modifying the tables and all everything is what something we have to be provided to other people, whoever is needed. For them, we have to be provided. So assigning privileges, right? So all these things is what something we have to be performed apart from comments what we have created, apart from privileges and all everything we have created. All these things is what something we have to be known with, and whatever the routine items do we have, or the comments, or the kind of privileges what we have. So all these things is what something which we have to be updated, is what something we have to be mentioned over here. Next, if you want to add any kind of scripts, right? So here, right, lastly important one is about scripting, because this is where sometime back I told you, right? So if you want to create any kind of scripting, right? So add, delete, update, insert, right? So different scripts and all everything. If you want to create any kind of scripts, or if you want to open a script file from the existing folder which is there, right? So assume that there was a folder where we want to update it, or if you want to identify any from anywhere in the database or something like this, is where generally this SQL script is what something which will be used. Means if you want to create an additional scripts, where we have an option, we can create a number of scripts and all that. So whatever the information is required and whatever the information to be updated into the existing database, whatever is needed, always we have to do. And finally, once we have done all that, you can see there is an option called here. You can see I'm not writing anything. I'm not writing the valid one. Okay, I'm just writing something like this, like add or something like. I'm just writing it. Okay, not writing anything. Right. So here you can see there is an option called apply changes. Right. So whenever we have written a query, for example, right, we have written a query, for example. So in this query and all, if you want to apply changes, where if you can click on apply changes, automatically whatever the changes you want to update in the existing database, subsequently those changes will be updated in this automatically, right? So this is where generally this apply changes, right? So all these things are something will be used. So these are the informations which we have to be known apart from data definitions and all. These are all not needed, but these are needed, right? So because what are the views we have, how to create tables, how to create routines, right? So assigning roles to that, right? So connection of the databases, right? So how to create different models, right? So these are the things, how to open the models, right? So how to open the scripts, because scripts is what something which normally we write. So how to create the scripts, right? So all these things is what something which we have to learn when we are working on SQL. This is all something which we have to be good with. So if we have, then it's an advantage for us, so that we can perform this much better. So because if you want to extract any information from the database to server connectivities, all that. This is all something which we can do it, depends on our requirement, all that. Is it clear?